Welcome to REM Reward, the podcast that explores the secrets of sleep and psychology. I'm your host, Ryan, and in each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of sleep and other topics such as mental well being and personal growth. If you want to unlock your full potential and receive the rewards that come with understanding the power of sleep, you're in the right place. To discover more tips and insights on improving your sleep and overall well being, visit our website and explore our other episodes at remreward.org. Today's guest is Dr. Benjamin Cheung, a lecturer and Indigenous Initiatives Coordinator in the Department of Psychology at the University of British Columbia. His work broadly examines cultural psychology and how our social worlds shape the way we think and behave. In this conversation, we dive into his cross-cultural study of sleep among Japanese and Canadian university students and discuss how cultural beliefs about rest might be just as important as biology in shaping how we feel. I hope you enjoy this episode. Perfect. All right, let's get started. My first question is what motivated you to study sleep habits across cultures, and especially in that paper you talked about specifically between Japanese and Canadian university students.
Yeah, so I actually kind of just fell into it in my graduate studies. So my supervisor, who is still a colleague of mine, his name is Dr. Stephen Heine, who is one of the authors on that paper. He has a habit of trying to figure out like what's the next big question in cultural psychology that he can try to answer. So, for example, he did a lot of work looking into cultural differences in self-esteem
Right.
in the 90s, which had been a huge question mark in cultural psychology. And then we worked together in the 2000s to try to better understand acculturation, which is a fancy term for cultural adaptation. And that was another big question mark. And cultural differences in sleep is another one of those big enigmas because there's so much that we don't know about sleep. And yet we spend almost a third of our lives
Mhm.
sleeping, essentially. And so, there's a lot we don't know about sleep, including, how we sleep and what can be changed by our culture. And so, even though it's a fundamentally biological behavior and people universally sleep, there's a lot of other surrounding aspects or what we call like parameters of sleep that we don't really fully understand. And when I'm talking about parameters of sleep, I'm talking about things like, as I said, the length of sleep, the environment around which we sleep and our beliefs about sleep. These are all different parameters of sleep, and they're very mysterious to a lot of us.
Right.
And as for why Japanese and Canadian university students, that was partly because of convenience,
Mhm.
partly because of our lab's existing research relationships. So Dr. Heine, whom I mentioned previously, he had actually lived and worked in Japan, and knows a lot, very familiar with Japanese culture, particularly how, differently sleep is practiced between Japanese people and Canadians. And we also have a very close relationship with a collaborator in Japan, who is Kosuke Takemura, who is one of the authors in that paper. And our university also has an exchange program established with one of the Japanese universities, Ritsumeikan University, as well. And all of these things combined together meant that it really only made sense for us to be looking at sleep between Japanese and Canadian university students. So that's the short of it.
That's super interesting. Thank you for that. Um,
Yeah.
Jumping off that, I think everyone listening and you as well, we've all heard that saying that we need at least 8 hours of sleep for good health. But your study, comparing Japanese, European, Canadian, and Asian Canadian students shows that Japanese students on average sleep around 6 hours, but they still report good health. So does this challenge the idea that 8 hours is a universal standard?
So I think it's pretty well understood that this 8 hours idea, it's not meant to be a one size fits all. There certainly is a certain range of typical adult sleep duration, and that range includes 8 hours that people will most likely need to function properly. But that really shouldn't be applied uniformly and universally either, right? Because I think to me, sleep is such an individually variable behavior.
Hmm.
And while, on average, sure, most people are going to be somewhere around 7 to 9 hours, doesn't mean that it has to be. And certainly some people need 10 hours of sleep to function, and some people need 6 hours of sleep only to function. So it's not helpful for us to make someone sleep more or to make someone sleep less because of some magical 8 hour ideal that we're shooting for. Everyone's going to experience sleep differently. And honestly, when it comes to sleep, I would much prefer sleep quality
Right.
over sleep duration. To me, I think that's what's most important.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people kind of really focus on duration and don't really think about quality of sleep or
Yeah.
really understand um,
Yeah.
kind of what that really means.
Yeah.
So that's a great point. And I think you basically just answered my question, but my next question was going to be if someone feels fine on 6 hours of sleep or, a short amount of sleep, should we still tell
Yeah.
them we need more? Um, so if you want to just quickly jump off that.
Yeah, like I said, I think sleep ends up being a very individually variable behavior, right? If someone tells me that they feel fine on 6 hours of sleep, that's not for me to judge or to comment on. Whether or not they're being honest about how they're feeling after 6 hours of sleep, that's a different matter, right?
Right.
Because I can imagine, or one can imagine, someone sleeping 6 hours and just pretending that they're okay because maybe they want to if it's like a guy, for instance, they might want feel like, oh, they want to be tough, they want to be
Yeah.
macho, they just want to like power through it, and that's not really the best thing for lacking sleep. I think what's more important is we're thinking whether or not if someone is saying that they are sleeping for 6 hours and they feel fine, there's a couple of ways of looking at it, right? Are we talking about is this a short-term sleeping 6 hours, or we're talking a long-term sleeping 6 hours? So if someone's norm is, let's say, sleeping 8 hours a night, right? Then feeling fine after sleeping for 6 hours for a couple of days, that's probably not going to be a huge issue
Right.
because I think you've accumulated enough sleep, regular, normal sleep, that you have the ability to, not sweat a couple of days where you're not sleeping as much. But if your norm is 8 hours, uh, but you're doing that you're sleeping for 6 hours for a longer period, then that means additional sleep debt. And that's, as you collect more and more sleep debt, the more difficult it is to recover from. So if we were to think about it in a different way, if the norm is indeed just about 6 hours and has functioned fine and has good mood, good energy overall, then I think that person is probably okay being on 6 hours of sleep.
Got it. So it really just is about that norm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think jumping off like what a norm is, what would you say if someone claimed they only need 5 hours a night to be productive? Is that actually possible, like on a biological level, or is it biologically unlikely?
Um, like I said, if someone claims that they only need 5 hours sleep a night to be productive, I'm not going to judge them. I'd only be amazed, jealous, envious
Yeah,
of that person because I'm very much not like that.
me too.
Certainly in North America, there are far fewer people who do fine from 5 hours of sleep compared to people who need more. That biologically, a lot of these things are possible. Although, as you start deviating from 7 to 9 hours ish, that that probability gets less and less and less,
Got
right?
it.
Because, generally speaking, sleep is oftentimes on this normal distribution, right? And most people are going to be somewhere around the middle, somewhere between 7 to 9 hours, and that's totally normal. Certainly, there are people who need more than that, and certainly there are people who are able to survive and function properly less than that. But as we start deviating away from that 7 to 9 hour approximate range, then it becomes less and less likely that someone is actually able to function off of that. I
Mhm.
know that there are people who are able to function off of like 3 hours of sleep, and they seem perfectly fine. But those are rare, few and far between. 5 hours, I feel like it's sort of to me, that's personal opinion, not a scientific opinion.
Mhm.
To me, 5 hours of sleep is sort of on the cusp of either you are really severely lacking sleep or you're just a phenomenal biological specimen.
Yeah, I'm really jealous if people who can, truly function well
Yeah, for sure.
with the less sleep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess going back to your study found that Japanese students not only slept less, but also believed sleep was ideal, and reported less fatigue and better health. So do you think cultural beliefs play just as big as a role as biology and how rested we feel?
Yeah, this is a really hard question. So we know that culture is an integral aspect of sleep
Hmm.
and how we sleep and a lot of different parameters of sleep. So inevitably, cultural beliefs about sleep will play a role in how people sleep. The difficult thing here is the complexity of the question of sleep, especially when it has to do with sort of the subjective consequences of sleep or subjective aspects of the consequences of sleep. For example, we can ask about how tired people are after they sleep, right? After maybe
Right.
sleeping for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, whatever. But their responses will likely be reliant on what they think are normative, right? So whether they think, yeah, I'm a little tired, but I think that's normal, and therefore I don't think I'm really all that tired, that's going to change how I respond. Even if, let's say, you and I, we objectively somehow, if we were able to get to that fine-grained level of data,
Right.
you and I objectively feel the same level of fatigue. Maybe you're hanging out around a group of people who routinely are like super high energy, etc. And so you are feeling like, oh man, compared to these people, I'm really tired. I'm feeling really tired because
Right.
I'm not at all like that. Whereas maybe I'm hanging out with a group of people who are usually just really chill, really mellow, and there's some level of fatigue that we're always talking about. In that case, then I might rate myself as not being all that tired or
Okay.
notably tired because it feels normative. That's something that we refer to as a reference group effect. Ultimately, with a lot of these subjective questionnaire kinds of items, that's one of the biggest challenges when it comes to cross-cultural comparisons,
Hmm.
right? Maybe people from a Japanese with more of a Japanese cultural background have a very different norm, a very different reference group from which they are deciding how to answer compared to people who have more of a, let's say, a European Canadian kind of cultural influence. And so that really makes it difficult for us to effectively draw these cross-cultural comparisons.
Right.
We do what we can, obviously, but because of that, I think we're still quite far away from fully understanding the relative roles of cultural beliefs and biology in affecting the consequences of sleep. But what I would say is, based on our data, culture certainly at least shapes our sleep behavior. It certainly shapes how we think about sleep and our beliefs about sleep. So, for example, another thing that we talked about in the paper, I think, is the idea that Japanese Canadians, or sorry, Japanese students and uni Canadian university students have very different beliefs about the
Yep.
relation between sleep and health, right? So one group believes that there is no relation really between sleep and health, and another group believes that there's a strong positive correlation between sleep and health. And a lot of that is it comes down to, cultural beliefs. Our data suggests that maybe that does go on to then impact the actual consequences of sleep. But until we're able to like physiologically measure markers of
Yeah.
fatigue, markers of stress, markers of sleep debt, that's still going to be an open question.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think you just kind of answered my next question was going to be, do you think changing how we think about sleep could actually help us feel better, even without increasing sleep time? And from what I understood, it really is based on kind of what you're thinking. And is it almost like like possibly a placebo effect on oneself? Basically, is that kind of what you're getting at, if
Yeah,
I'm understanding.
so I think it's important to recognize that what we were looking at was the impact of culture on sleep. And I think as tempting as it might be to think of it in this way, culture isn't just, let's say, a way of thinking, right? I think
Right.
culture, it's an entire system of thinking, of feeling, of behaving, of being over a long period of time
Okay.
within a community of people who will reinforce certain ways of thinking and feeling and behaving. And so I'm not currently convinced, I'm open to being wrong. Uh, I'm not currently convinced that we can simply think our way into reacting differently
Right.
to
Right.
the same sleep parameters. Uh, Changing sleep behaviors is one thing, right? Uh, Being okay with sleeping longer versus less, or feeling like, okay, fine, I'll sleep for 8 hours, or okay, fine, I'll have to sleep for 6 hours. The behavioral change is one thing, but the cognitive consequences of behavioral changes, that might be a little more difficult.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and based off what you mentioned, do your findings suggest we need to reconsider things like public health messaging around sleep to make it more, I guess, culturally aware and personalized to different people?
As much as I would like our paper to be so influential, I don't think it's necessary for public health messaging to go to that level, at least not yet. I
Okay,
think
got
we
it.
still don't know enough about the cultural impacts
Right,
uh, on the consequences of sleep. It may be appropriate to teach about this kind of awareness of cultural differences in sleep behaviors, let's say in schools, whether it's elementary school or high school
right.
or university or what have you, when sleep is taught in general as a matter of sort of general cultural understanding, so that people have some awareness that at least in school, people might have some awareness that, there's this idea of 8 hours, but it's okay if you feel like you don't need 8 hours. It's okay also that sometimes you feel like you need more than 8 hours. I think the danger here is people might take this kind of messaging if we just, talk about this kind of cultural variability without any safeguards in terms of how to actually discuss it. And then the problem is that people will then take this too far. And then
Mm.
suddenly everyone is like, well, if we don't need 8 hours, then I'm just going to sleep for 6 hours.
Right, okay, yeah, that's a
And
great point.
then that creates a very different unintended public health issue, which is chronic lack of sleep. And I'm pretty sure that we're already experiencing that quite a bit, especially in the school system, whether it's in Canada or it's in the US.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of anecdotes from teachers who talk about how their kids, whether it's elementary school kids or high school kids, often show up like zombies, often show up very sleep deprived,
Hmm.
not really because they're studying hard, but more because what often happens is that the kids and a lot of adults do this as well. They're scrolling on their phones
Yeah,
quite a lot right before they go to sleep. Or they might do this thing some people refer to as revenge procrastination. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term.
I'm not,
So
no.
revenge procrastination is this phenomenon whereby because people spend their time during the day doing so much of the stuff that they have to do, they don't want to do, and not enough time being able to do things that they actually want to do, which is to like have leisure time or
Right.
to relax or to wind down, they end up doing revenge procrastination. So they procrastinate going to sleep
I see.
by endlessly scrolling to take revenge on the fact that they weren't able to do this kind of leisurely activity until later on at night.
Yeah.
And that's become, I think, a pretty salient, significant problem within general society. And so I worry that if people were to normalize this idea of uh, you don't need 8 hours, which is true, but I think my concern is how it gets normalized and
Right.
whether people are going to normalize the idea of, oh, then that means I can just subsist off of 6 hours, which is true for some people, but very likely not true for most people.
Yeah.
And so I think there needs to be a lot of caution. So to raise this to the level of public health messaging, I think it's a little premature at this time. If
Got it.
they were to do this, there would need to be a lot of discussions around having a nuanced perspective on what moving away from a normative 8 hour sleep schedule needs to be.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing point you bring up. I've seen firsthand, and as a student, a lot of kids or probably adults as well believe like they are on that lower end. Like they think, oh, I'm the 6 hours, I'm the 5 hours.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a really great point you bring up, and it definitely does have a lot of nuance that would need to be, really thought out. So it's a really
Yeah.
great point. And my next question was, since your study focused on university students, do you think their sleep behaviors are unique, and can these patterns reflect, broader cultural trends among all ages and stuff like that?
Yeah, this requires a bit of nuance here. So I think university students' sleep behaviors can certainly be a little unique, more so in Japan than in Canada, perhaps. So yes, I recognize that university students in Canada probably don't sleep that much because of their stress about schooling or
Mhm.
other mental health challenges or life struggles, what have you. But there's a lot of variability. And I think many people do try to stick to the idealized 8 hours of sleep. I suspect that that's probably also what's going on within the broader community outside of the university. On the other hand, I think university is a very different experience in Japan. Whereas Canadian students work their butts off to finish university, Japanese students work their butts off to get into university.
Right.
Because it's ultimately the university name and prestige and renown that helps them with their social standing, with getting
Mhm.
jobs, job recognition, that kind of stuff. And so once they get into university, it's a lot more chill
Right.
than it
Okay.
is in Canada. So a lot of students will spend a lot of this time not going to class. They will spend a lot of this time partying, drinking, hanging out with friends. It's very similar to what happens in Korea as well. So in Korea, they talk about 술munhwa, this alcohol culture.
Right. Okay.
And that's very strong amongst university students who also, party and drink a lot during their university days, and many also don't attend classes either. Obviously, this is not all of them. There are
Right.
many students who are like very, very serious about their classes and try to get top grades. And usually, oftentimes, these are students who have other kinds of ambitions, like want to go to med school or want to go to graduate school or something like that. But it's also not uncommon for classes in some Japanese universities to over-enroll students. What that means is that they have more students enrolled than there are seats in the classroom because it's almost an expectation that most of the students aren't
Wow.
actually going to be sitting in on these classes. So this would suggest that a lot of the students aren't actually sleeping all that much. And presumably this is going to be very different from the rest of the population. So there are certainly some potential limitations to our findings because it's very much limited to a university sample. Um, but it's also very difficult to do these kinds of sleep studies in general
Yeah.
to get enough people to come in and help us with these studies. And in a way, university students, whether it's Canadian or Japanese university students, are just easier to recruit as participants.
Got it. Okay. Wow. Yeah. I didn't even realize how the university experience between those students could be so different. And that's a really
Very, yeah.
interesting point you bring up. Yeah. And talking about that's interesting is one of the most interesting findings was that Asian Canadian students who are genetically similar to Japanese students had sleep patterns more like European Canadians. So I guess if you can talk more about what does it say about the role of culture environment over biology?
Yeah. Again, when it comes to the consequences of sleep, that's hard for us to say, but things like actual sleep behaviors, those are much more easily changeable. So when it comes to behavior, I can pretty safely say that we're very much influenced by our local ecology,
Hmm.
as you can call it that. Especially as we're surrounded by people who do things differently, and maybe we're constantly receiving messaging about behaving differently. For example, students on exchange coming to Canada, they see other people who are sleeping more than they're sleeping. They might be told by other people that they should be sleeping more. And perhaps systems are set in place. Like the entire cultural environment is set up with these different norms in place. For example, I don't know about New Jersey. In Vancouver, it's certainly the case that, places generally close pretty early.
Hmm.
Very, very few late night establishments that are in operation. And so that's going to be also promoting more early sleeping behaviors
Got
as
it.
well, because what else are you going to do unless you find people to hang out with
Right.
late at night. And so again, we have the system in which you're receiving messaging from multiple sources in multiple directions about what you ought to be doing for your as your sleeping behavior, whether it's from people around you, whether it's just observing what other people do, or just what the norms of the environment seem to suggest
Right.
to you or seem to be telling you. So, I think when it comes to behavior, that's much more changeable. Again, when it comes to consequences, that's harder for us to say.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good point. Behavior versus consequences. Yeah. And I guess going to a more, general question, do you think sleep and fatigue are underappreciated factors in how students experience stress, anxiety, or academic burnout?
Sleep and fatigue are absolutely important. I don't know if they're underappreciated. I think students themselves appreciate it plenty. Maybe administrators might not.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, but yeah, they are really important predictors of stress, of anxiety, academic burnout. And in fact, I think these things are all very cyclical, right? So as stress and anxiety and burnout increase, the less that a student is going to be sleeping, which is only going to exacerbate the existing stress and anxiety and burnout, which will severely impact sleep and on and on and on. And sleep is notoriously important for things like attention, mood, daily functioning. So poor sleep hygiene, a lot of these things are going to significantly predict a lot of negative cognitive outcomes for students, like not being able to pay attention in class or not understanding things in class, sort of like having things go in one year and go out the other. Or maybe students end up having to fall asleep in class because they are so sleep deprived and they're
Right.
dealing with so much sleep debt. And then, of course, they miss a lot of information, and because of that, they get stressed out and they get anxious, and that increases the burnout from them trying to catch up, constantly trying to catch up. And this is also going to have an impact on their mental health as well, because if they're constantly trying to catch up, they're not able to do things for leisure, for pleasure. Social activities, social interactions are going to become increasingly rare because they have to isolate themselves to continue to study. And that's going to also lead them to sleep less, and two, sleep more poorly. All of these things are terrible for academic outcomes, mental health
Hmm.
outcomes,
Right.
cognitive outcomes, etc.
Yeah, that's another amazing point you bring up, and I think that cycle is very common among students, and it's definitely very dangerous.
Yeah,
It's hard to break out of sometimes.
yeah, for sure.
For my last two questions, for the first one, how can universities, especially with those with diverse or international student populations, apply your findings to better support student well-being?
So I don't think it would be practical for universities to implement things with this kind of diversity in mind. But
Okay.
I do think that it would be important for universities to be more concerned about university students' sleeping behaviors. Uh, and this, I think, can come in a lot of different forms, right? So, for example, it would really be helpful for universities to encourage more faculty members to record their lectures. Because having lecture recordings at their disposal means that students don't have to stress out about, oh, I can't
Mm.
attend class really early in the morning because I had work. And I'm going to talk about that work piece a little later on. I think because because if students are having to decide between am I going to sleep and go to school or am I going to be working to feed myself,
Right.
that's a difficult choice for a student to be in. And I would assume that most students are going to feel like, well, they need money to survive in this society, in this very strongly capitalistic system. And so that's going to have negative implications for their academic outcomes. So having re lecture recordings at their disposal means that they don't have to worry as much about missing classes, that they are still able to, one, work and feed themselves and clothe themselves, but two, be able to catch up with what's happening in the class as much as possible. I genuinely believe that there's always something that gets lost if you don't attend classes in person. But at the end of the day, students are adults, and I would like to see the option being given to
Yeah.
students so that they are able to exercise, their own mental abilities whether or not they're going to be in class on any given day, and that's totally fine. Another thing that that I hope to see is maybe in reconsidering how many courses students need to take per term to maintain certain scholarships. And this is especially the case for international students.
Mm.
A lot of international students, at least in my area, a lot of international students, in order for them to maintain scholarships, have to take a really heavy course load and maintain a certain average as well. And I've seen a lot of international students who are trying to adjust to new cultural norms, new cultural environment, new cultural settings, and they really struggle with trying to maintain all of these things at the same time while trying to adjust to to this new environment. And I think that really only impacts their sleep because they're struggling to do all of these things at the same time. So I would like to see, a reconsideration of what students have to do, need to do to maintain their scholarships, or maybe the amount of financial support that's available for students as well. That would prevent students from having to work a lot to
Mm.
support
Right.
themselves, and be able to devote more time to schooling. I've had students who had to work three jobs while trying to maintain a full course load, meaning that they weren't able to sleep much on a daily basis. One particular student that I'm thinking of, that was certainly reflected in their performance in class.
Wow.
And I really hate seeing students being placed in such difficult positions, because um, I would like to see students thrive in university, and be able to explore their passions and their interests without feeling like they're giving up a part of their existence,
Yeah.
and giving up mental health just to be able to do so.
Yeah, those are some great suggestions you bring up. It really seems like it's kind of small or big things that the universities professors can do to kind of
Yeah.
support students in a way. And
Yeah.
that's a really great point you bring up. Yeah. And for my last question for everyone just like me who's curious out there, What do you think is next for your research? Are you planning to look at, other cultures, age groups, expand into mental health or productivity outcomes, or I guess what do you have in mind?
So I'm not doing much in terms of work on sleep moving forward. My new work actually has more to do with working with indigenous students
Wow.
and trying to understand their experience within the post-secondary education and what different university departments can do to try to make the environment more welcoming for them. But what I can talk about is the second paper that has come out since this first paper that you're talking about
Hmm.
originally. It came out just a few months ago, and it was really interesting. It found that variability in sleep worldwide doesn't seem to be predicting health outcomes, uh, but rather it's more about how much people sleep differs from their specific cultural experiences that actually predict health outcomes. In other words, two people who sleep the same amount of time will likely experience different health outcomes depending on how much less than their cultural ideal they're sleeping
Oh,
for.
wow.
So that there seems to be sort of a bit of, again, this impact of ecology. Uh, uh, how much of it is because of culture? How much of it is because of genetic selection within a particular region or climate over time? That's not a question we're able to answer at the moment. Oftentimes we use culture as a very big, generic, abstract
Right.
placeholder for people from different places, right? But people from different places can differ for all sorts of reasons. And we are not able to pinpoint exactly what the source of those differences might be. But certainly, there's something about different cultural norms that are more predictive of, or deviation from particular cultural norms that are more predictive of health outcomes than, again, applying this universal standard of
Hmm.
8 hours for everyone is being able to predict health outcomes.
Wow, that is really interesting. And I'll make sure to link the paper we're talking about and that other paper down below and everything about you down below.
For sure.
And those are all the questions I had for today.
Awesome.
Again, thank you for coming on here. I'm sure all the listeners are just as grateful as I am for you to take the time and answer these questions. Again, as I mentioned, I will link everything down below. And thank you again. Of
All right. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
course. Thank you for tuning in to the REM Reward podcast. Before you go, we'd appreciate your support by subscribing, liking, and leaving your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for our next podcast, where we will be joined by a special guest speaker to explore even more about the fascinating world of sleep and psychology.